Have you ever wondered what mysteries lurk beyond the romanticized legends of the Old West? We're not talking about duels at high noon or the mournful songs of a lone rider, but something far more earthy and visceral: the food. Forgetting for a moment the tales of brave heroes and notorious outlaws, let's peel back the layers on a world most people never consider: the culinary landscape of a frontier saloon. What did people truly eat, and was it a feast or just a means of survival? Before you get comfortable, maybe take a moment to hit that like button and consider subscribing if you find this journey interesting. And tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It's always fascinating to see how far these stories travel. Now, let's set the scene. Imagine the lights are low, maybe a gentle hum fills the air, and we begin our journey into the wild, unvarnished past. The very first thing that assaulted your senses upon entering a saloon wasn't the clatter of a rigged poker game or the off-key piano. It was the smell. And not the imagined scent of sizzling steak. This was a complex perfume of sweat-soaked travelers, stale tobacco, spilled beer, and damp splintered wood. It was a bouquet of unwashed livestock, and if you were fortunate, the faintest whisper of something cooking. Some establishments attempted to mask this aroma with a thick layer of sawdust on the floor or dense clouds of pipe smoke, but many embraced it. As the proprietors would often joke, wiping down the bar with a less than pristine rag, "You don't come here for the atmosphere." Yet, a kitchen, however basic, was always present. It might be a crude fire pit with a bubbling pot of beans, or a scowling woman in a sooty apron stirring a mystery stew with a tool that could easily double as a bludgeon. Food was being prepared, and if you could detect its scent through the thick haze of whiskey and grit, you were halfway to a meal. But getting a seat was another matter entirely. Saloons were not designed for leisurely dining. There were no waitstaff, no elegant menus, just a few shaky tables, unstable chairs, and a long counter where you could eat, drink, or engage in a heated debate. Regulars would receive a shouted "beans or stew?" and would reply without so much as a glance. A stranger, however, was scrutinized, as if the cook were trying to determine if you were a paying customer or just a body waiting to hit the floor. This was the essence of dining in the frontier. It wasn't about pleasure, it was about subsistence. You ate whatever was available, not whatever you craved. Your dining companions could be your next business partner, or the person who saves your life, or robs you blind. And if the food disagreed with you, well, that's what the liquor was for. In the hierarchy of the frontier kitchen, beans were royalty. Not because of their flavor, but because they were cheap, virtually indestructible, and could outlast a gunfight and a cattle stampede. Pinto, black, or navy beans, it made no difference. As long as it was dry and could be boiled into submission, it went into the pot. Beans were the unsung champions of the kitchen, served morning, noon, and night to men who hadn't seen a vegetable since their journey began. The process was simple. Pour beans into a pot, boil them for hours over a questionable flame, then serve with a side of questionable meat and a mild apologetic shrug. Some cooks, feeling particularly ambitious, might add lard or onions, but most didn't bother. In this rugged world, flavor was a luxury. Beans were dependable, filling, and predictable, qualities more valued than gold. They fueled long journeys, powered all-night card games, and provided something to chew on while you waited for the musician to start up again. The only real issue? The aftermath. One individual eating beans was manageable. A dozen men in a saloon full of beans was a biological event. It's rumored that some disagreements were started not by insults, but by a silent, deadly affront near the hearth. But beans were the steadfast friend. When the meat was gone, the fresh produce scarce, and the cook running on fumes, the beans remained, unbothered, unburnt, and unchanging. Some travelers even preferred them, as they could be eaten cold, reheated endlessly, and even used as a form of makeshift currency. There's a tale of a man who once acquired a horse in exchange for a bag of salted beans and a solemn vow to never return. So, while saloon food had its highs and lows, beans were the constant, the humble, beating heart of 1,000 dusty meals. You didn't love them, you respected them, and sometimes that was enough. If beans were the soul of the frontier kitchen, then salt pork was its rugged, slightly greasier backbone. A slab of meat so resilient it could endure a hurricane, a bar brawl, and 6 months tied to a saddle without changing its texture. This was not bacon, though many would have you believe it was. It was pork belly, heavily salted and often smoked, preserved in barrels with enough brine to season a small ocean. The salt kept it from spoiling and also arguably from being truly palatable. Cooked correctly, salt pork was tolerable. Fried in a hot skillet until crispy and sizzling, it offered a hit of flavor, grease, and a satisfying crunch that made you momentarily forget the questionable origins of your dinner. But cooked incorrectly, which was a frequent occurrence, it was like chewing on a salted shoe sole. Still, salt pork had its loyal followers. It was easy to transport, difficult to ruin, and it added a powerful salty kick to even the most tasteless pot of beans, or at least provided a good reason to drink more liquor. The saloon cooks never let an ounce go to waste. The rendered fat was used to fry everything from potatoes to biscuits, and the tougher parts were tossed into stews, given to the dogs, or to unlucky newcomers who couldn't tell the difference. One bite would teach them a harsh lesson. And yes, sometimes the meat was suspicious, with a faint greenish hue or an odd scent. But in these places, the question wasn't, is it fresh? It was more like, did it kill the last guy? If the answer was no, you gave it a try. Salt pork was also incredibly versatile. It could be diced into beans, slapped onto biscuits, fried on its own, or gnawed on like jerky. It was a prized possession for travelers, and cooks relied on it when the fresh meat ran out or the stew pot was running low. It wasn't elegant or healthy, but in a world where you might ride for days before your next hot meal, salt pork got the job done. And if you survived it, you were tougher for it. On the frontier, stew was the great culinary equalizer. Hot, vaguely meaty, and profoundly suspicious, it was the one dish almost every saloon served, no matter how run down the kitchen. Why? Because stew was the perfect disguise for whatever scraps the cook had on hand or couldn't legally describe. The base was simple: a pot, a fire, and pure imagination. You would start with water, maybe some beans or potatoes, and then add whatever hadn't managed to escape. Beef? Sure. Rabbit? Absolutely. Squirrel? You bet. Rattlesnake? If it wasn't a threat anymore, in it went. One traveler once claimed he found a shoelace in his bowl. He wasn't even upset. It was the most tender part. The quality of the meat varied wildly. Some stews had soft chunks of beef from the local butcher. Others, well, they had meat, the kind you didn't ask about. If the chef looked nervous and the neighborhood's dog population had recently dropped, you just ate around the tough bits and hoped for the best. Any vegetables were usually boiled into a thick mush. Carrots became orange smears. Onions vanished. Potatoes held out the longest before finally giving up. The final result was a gray-brown bubbling concoction that smelled much better than it looked and tasted better than you'd expect, assuming there was enough salt. Spices were a rare luxury. Most stews got their flavor from whatever residue was left on the cook's hands or knife. If you got black pepper, you were in a high-class establishment. If you got chili powder, congratulations, your sinuses were about to be cleared by force. Despite the mystery, stew was a source of comfort for the weary traveler. It was hot, it was filling, and it could be stretched indefinitely by just adding more water. A single pot might feed a dozen people or be reheated for 3 days straight until it developed the consistency and character of old paste. You didn't eat stew because it was delicious. You ate it because it was there, because it was warm, and because nothing else in town was edible unless you enjoyed chewing on a plug of tobacco. Just remember, you never asked what was in it, because on the frontier, not knowing wasn't just bliss, it was dinner. Not everyone could afford a steak, but almost every saloon had some kind of bread to soak up the stew. This bread usually came in two forms: soft, flaky biscuits that were a small slice of heaven when fresh, or hardtack, which was essentially bread's undead cousin. Let's start with the biscuits. When they were made correctly, a rare but magical occurrence, they were warm, buttery, and so flaky they could convince a person they'd stumbled into a proper home kitchen. The cooks who could make good biscuits were local legends. Some swore their secret was lard. Others believed in buttermilk. A few probably just had good luck and low standards. These biscuits were best served with beans or stew, used to soak up any broth that hadn't already scalded your tongue. They were often baked in cast iron pans over an open flame and served with a dubious chunk of butter or a drizzle of molasses if the place was fancy. Then there was hardtack, a slab of flour and water baked until it could survive a nuclear winter. Originally made for soldiers and sailors, it made its way west for one simple reason: it never spoiled. It also barely qualified as food. Eating hardtack required a strategy. First, you had to inspect it for weevils, which wasn't a deal breaker, just an added crunch. Then you had to soak it in stew, coffee, or whiskey until it finally softened, a process that could take an eternity. Even after soaking, chewing hardtack was a commitment. You didn't just eat it, you fought it. Still, both biscuits and hardtack served their purpose. They were cheap, portable, and filling. And in a world where calories mattered more than cuisine, that was all that mattered. So, if you walked into a dusty saloon and saw a plate of steaming biscuits, you counted your blessings. If they handed you a puck of hardtack, well, at least it came with a story and maybe a chipped tooth. If you think modern coffee is strong, you haven't tried cowboy coffee. This was a brew so powerful, it didn't just wake you up, it challenged you to stay awake. On the frontier, coffee was about survival, not flavor. It wasn't roasted by origin, filtered through fancy machines, or topped with a design. It was roughly ground or not at all, and dumped into a kettle to boil until the liquid turned black and seemed to be alive. The typical recipe was simple. Take water from any source, hopefully not from the horse trough, add a handful of grounds, measured by instinct, boil it fiercely. Don't strain it, don't question it, just pour and hope for the best. The result was a thick, dark potion that smelled like burnt ambition and tasted like retribution. It was common for the last sip to contain more grounds than liquid, providing both caffeine and a bit of roughage. And yet, people loved it. Coffee kept you warm on chilly desert mornings. It kept you alert through the night watch. It helped with hangovers and digested questionable stew. It was fuel, comfort, and a form of tough love all in a single tin cup. Saloons didn't always serve coffee unless they had a kitchen, but if they did, it came out steaming hot, likely old, and strong enough to strip paint. One traveler described it as a kick from a mule, but you miss it when it's gone. Those who were lucky might have added sugar or canned milk. Everyone else just gritted their teeth and endured. And if a saloon had been reheating the same pot all day, you got the most potent brew known to humankind, thick as tar and twice as unforgiving. It's worth noting that some cooks would reuse old grounds to make the pot last longer. This practice resulted in a drink that tasted of pure disappointment, but it still counted, because on the frontier, you didn't drink coffee for enjoyment, you drank it to stay on your feet. On the frontier, meat wasn't just food, it was currency, status, and sometimes a test of courage. If you could afford it, you might walk into a saloon and order a steak. What you received depended entirely on luck, timing, and whether the cook held a personal grudge against you. Steak, in theory, was a luxury. In reality, it was often a tough, overcooked slab of beef fried in a pan with lard and scorched into submission, served with absolutely no garnish. If you asked for it to be cooked medium, the cook would just stare at you until you took back your request. When fresh beef wasn't available, which was most of the time, saloons used other options. Dried jerky, salted buffalo, or sometimes venison or even wild boar if someone had been successful in a hunt. And by successful, we mean they managed to hit it and drag it back before the vultures did. In mining towns or remote settlements, the meat got more inventive. Squirrel stew, rattlesnake roast, or roasted jackrabbit with seasonings. If it had legs and didn't belong to a customer's horse, it was fair game. Sometimes you were served meat and no one told you what it was. That was your cue to eat quietly and not ask any questions. If you chewed for too long or found something that looked like a whisker, you just took a sip of whiskey, nodded solemnly, and accepted your fate. There was also the risk of age. Some meats had been around long enough to have earned nicknames. Cooks would slice off the bad parts, drown the rest in gravy, and tell you it was well aged. If your plate twitched when you poked it, you were allowed one raised eyebrow and nothing more. Still, when the meat was fresh and the cook wasn't intoxicated, you might get a real meal. A steaming slab of meat, an egg on top, and maybe a biscuit on the side. A plate that reminded you why a person would survive a gunfight. But for the most part, you ate what was available and prayed it wasn't trying to eat you back. On the frontier, dessert wasn't a formal course. It was a happy accident, the result of a cook with extra ingredients and a sliver of kindness. But if there was one dependable sweet comfort, it was cornbread. Made from simple cornmeal, water or milk, lard, and sometimes a bit of baking powder, cornbread was the ultimate multi-tool of the frontier kitchen. It could be baked in pans, fried in a skillet, or even dropped by the spoonful into a boiling stew if the cook was in a hurry. Eaten plain, cornbread was often dry and crumbly, and it was best served fresh, which meant it was almost never fresh. You'd usually get a piece that had been sitting by the stove since morning, hardened like a rock. But this is where the real magic came in: molasses. This dark, sticky, syrupy miracle turned dry cornbread into something nearly glorious. It was the traveler's frosting, the outlaw's drizzle, a lonely gambler's last bit of joy before losing everything. Molasses was cheap, lasted well in the heat, and could hide the sins of even the driest baked goods. If a saloon had a barrel of it, you were in luck. If they warmed it before serving, you were practically dining at a 5-star establishment by local standards. Some cooks even went a step further, pouring molasses over skillet-fried cornbread and adding a pinch of salt. It wasn't quite cake, but it felt like it if you'd been chewing jerky and hardtack all week. Cornbread with molasses became the standard dessert. Quick, inexpensive, filling, and sweet enough to calm your nerves after a long ride or a close call at the poker table. No icing, no whipped cream, no frills, just grit, grain, and gooey satisfaction. For many, it was more than enough. When your life involved cattle drives, dust storms, and the occasional shootout, a simple sweet treat was a powerful reminder that not everything in this world was trying to kill you. If you were lucky enough to walk into a saloon before noon, and preferably not bleeding, you might have been offered eggs and chicken. If so, you were witnessing either a miracle or a trap. Let's start with the eggs. Fresh eggs on the frontier were like gold. Not actual gold, but nearly as rare and just as fragile. Chickens weren't kept for fun. They were feisty, prone to wandering, and frequently stolen. If a saloon had eggs, they either had their own chickens, a local supplier, or a secret smuggling operation. What kind of eggs were they? Hopefully chicken, possibly duck, maybe something else. You learned not to ask. You ordered eggs, and what you got depended entirely on the cook's mood and the egg's age. Some were scrambled to hide their true color. Others were fried until the yolk turned to leather. And if an egg wobbled when it hit your plate, that was a sign from the universe to order whiskey instead. As for chicken, it was on the menu, but rarely served. If it said fried chicken, what you'd likely get was a scrawny, angry bird that had been fried in lard until all the flavor was gone. Chicken wasn't always worth the effort of chewing, but it was meat, it was hot, and it wasn't beans again, so people ate it with gratitude. You might get a drumstick the size of your thumb, or a whole quarter roasted over an open flame. You might also find a feather in your gravy, which was just part of the charm. Breakfast with eggs and chicken was a status symbol for saloons. It announced, we have food that didn't come from a can or a barrel. If the eggs were warm and the chicken wasn't dry, you'd tell your friends for weeks. If it made you sick, that was just the West's way of reminding you who was in charge. Still, there was something hopeful about ordering eggs. They meant morning, they meant survival, and maybe, just maybe, they meant you'd live to drink again that night. On the frontier, pie was more than just a dessert. It was a statement. When you saw a pie on the bar, steam rising, crust golden, the scent of apples drifting through the smoke and whiskey, you knew this saloon meant business. You also knew someone in the kitchen had put in real effort, which was practically a love letter in a land of bean mush and overcooked pork. Now, let's be clear, pie on the frontier was not a perfect lattice-top pastry with fresh-picked fruit. It was a rustic, uneven creation. Crusts were lumpy, and fillings were made from canned or dried fruit and usually served lukewarm. Whipped cream? Not unless a cow followed you in. The most common types were apple, peach, or some kind of berry, which was a flexible category that sometimes included raisins. A cook with a sweet tooth might add a dash of cinnamon. If not, you got crust, sugar, and hope. Still, pie was a rare treat. Many travelers hadn't seen one since they left home, and saloons knew that offering pie gave them a competitive edge. A good slice could attract customers from 2 towns over, and if the pie was warm and flaky, people would argue over the last piece. There are stories of poker games ending in a duel over a dessert dispute. In a world where men had been stabbed for spilled whiskey, pie was considered sacred. Of course, not all pies were created equal. Some were mostly crust, some were experimental. Some had fillings that vaguely resembled fruit. But if the stars aligned, the cook was sober, the oven was hot, and the fruit hadn't fermented, that pie was something truly special. On the frontier, cheese was a bit like a poker game, full of risk, a little bluffing, and a high chance you'd regret your choices the next morning. It did exist, but only if you knew where to look. Even then, you had to be brave because it wasn't shipped in neat wax-wrapped wheels. It was made locally, often by someone who had once read about cheese making while inebriated. Most saloon cheese came in 2 forms, hard, yellow, and suspiciously moist, or soft, crumbly, and slightly aggressive to the nose. Since refrigeration was a luxury, your cheese likely had a distinct personality. It might be cheddar, or it might be a lump of guesswork with salt on top. And if it squeaked when you bit into it, that was between you and your jaw. Cheese was usually served in chunks with bread, jerky, or, if you were lucky, a pickle. It helped cut through the saltiness of everything else and gave travelers a protein boost between fights. You could even melt it over beans if the cook was feeling artistic. But be careful, some saloons cut corners. The cheese might be old butter that had gone wrong, or curdled milk pressed into a bar shape and rolled in pepper to distract you. A traveling trader once claimed he bought cheese in a mining town that tasted like boiled sock with a rind. He still ate the whole thing, because even bad cheese was still cheese. A saloon that offered any cheese at all stood out. It meant the owner had connections to a local farm, or at least to a cow that hadn't been stolen yet. Offering cheese wasn't about flavor. It was a sign of prestige in a place where most people still bathed with sand. If a meal could be soaked in vinegar and forgotten in a jar, it was probably served in a saloon. Pickling wasn't just about flavor, it was a survival strategy. Before refrigeration, kitchens relied on brine and sourness to keep food from spoiling. Vegetables, eggs, fruit, even meat, nothing was safe from the preserving power of vinegar. This is how we ended up with pickled everything. Pickled cucumbers were a classic, crunchy, sharp, and a perfect chaser for whiskey. If you were lucky, they were made fresh with spices. If not, they tasted like regret. Pickled eggs were a staple, floating in cloudy jars behind the bar. They looked like ghostly eyes and had the texture of sadness. Some swore by them as a quick shot of protein. Others cursed them. Pickled onions were a common sight, sharp and strong enough to end an unwanted conversation. One bite, and you could talk to someone from a mile away. Even pickled peaches or pears might show up, turning dried fruit into a dish that was both confusing and strangely addictive. The beauty of pickled goods was their shelf life. A saloon could keep jars for months, even years, without worrying about spoilage. And in a place where meat went bad faster than a poker hand, that was a huge advantage. Of course, not all pickled items were created equal. Sometimes jars weren't sealed properly. Sometimes the cook got creative. And sometimes the pickled things seemed to stare back at you. There are tales of men biting into pickled sausages only to find bones. Still, pickled foods were part of the frontier experience. Salty, sour, and strangely satisfying, just like everything else out there. You didn't eat them for pleasure, you ate them because they probably wouldn't kill you. When food was scarce, the kitchen was closed, or the stew looked like it still had a pulse, people turned to the most dependable item on the saloon menu: whiskey. It was always available, required no preparation, and if you drank enough of it, you forgot you were hungry, or that you'd just eaten a bowl of squirrel mystery meat. Whiskey on the frontier wasn't aged in oak barrels or curated by experts. It was rough, raw, and often dangerous. Made from corn, rye, or whatever was available. It was distilled in back rooms, barns, and bathtubs. The result was a liquid that could clean wounds, strip paint, and fuel a fistfight. Some called it rot gut, others chain lightning, and a few simply referred to it as lunch. When the beans were burnt and the bread was moldy, men drank their calories, one burning shot at a time. Saloon whiskey wasn't just a drink, it was a survival tool. It helped numb the pain of dust, heartbreak, broken ribs, and highly questionable stew. One shot before a duel, two after, and maybe three more while you waited to see if your bullet wound was serious. Saloons often served whiskey specials with a side of beans or a biscuit, not for taste, but to keep you from falling over. Some men ordered whiskey with a pickled egg floating in it, which counted as both a drink and a meal. And of course, whiskey was social currency. You bought it to make friends, to start a fight, and to apologize after both. You could judge a saloon's reputation by how quickly its whiskey could knock a man off his stool. Quality? Don't ask. Some of it was little more than colored moonshine. Additives ranged from tobacco juice to pepper. It burned on the way down, and if it didn't, you were probably drinking something worse. Still, nobody complained because whiskey was warm, cheap, and honest. It was the only item on the menu that never lied about what it was. And on nights when your meal came in a glass with no fork and no judgment, you raised it high and called it dinner. In any saloon that dared to serve food, there was a shadowy figure whose power rivaled that of the bartender, the sheriff, and the local religious leader, the cook. This individual, often unshaven and always irritable, was either a life-saving genius or a culinary war criminal. There was no in-between. You never see them smile, but you would remember their cooking for days, either out of gratitude or gastrointestinal distress. Saloon cooks weren't formally trained. They were usually ex-miners, former prisoners, or people who knew how to build a fire and weren't scared of questionable meat. Their kitchen was a fire pit, a dented stove, and a single cast iron pan that hadn't been washed since the gold rush. And yet, somehow, they fed entire saloons. On a good day, they might make a pot of chili that could bring a man to his knees in a good way. The biscuits would be warm, the beans cooked through, and the cornbread just sweet enough to remind you of home. But on a bad day, the beans were burned, the meat was gray, and the stew had an unsettling layer of oil that moved when the pot was still. You didn't complain. You couldn't. The rules were clear. Never insult the cook. They controlled everything: the salt, the grease, the mystery meat ratio. If they liked you, you got the freshest piece. If not, you got the scrapings from last night's disaster, reheated into chili surprise. They also served as unofficial bouncers. Nobody wanted to be hit by a ladle that had just survived frying salt pork. And if the cook had a cleaver, which many did, they could clear a room faster than a shotgun. Despite their moods, these cooks were vital. They kept people on their feet, from passing out, and from collapsing mid-sentence. They worked long hours in heat and smoke, took insults as seasoning, and lived by one rule: if you don't like it, there's the door or the whiskey. So whether they were your savior or your saboteur, you always nodded respectfully to the cook, because on the frontier, they held your stomach and your fate in their greasy, powerful hands. Now that we've walked through the swinging doors, smelled the stew, and stared down a pickled egg in a jar, the real question remains: would you actually eat the food served at a saloon? Let's be honest, a modern person might not survive the experience. The beans were basic, the meat was a gamble, and the stew was more of a mystery than a meal. You'd need strong teeth, a stronger stomach, and the kind of hunger that comes from riding for hours with nothing but dust in your lungs. But here's the thing: for the travelers, miners, and wanderers of the frontier, this food wasn't about gourmet flavors or elegant presentation. It was about survival. It was about calories, heat, and a warm plate between gunfights or another night sleeping in a barn. You didn't ask where the meat came from. You didn't complain if the biscuit crumbled like chalk. You just sat down, ate what was given to you, and washed it down with something strong enough to kill germs or at least make you stop caring. And when the food was good, when the beans were fresh, the coffee didn't bite back, and the cook had a little molasses for the cornbread, it felt like a miracle. So, would you eat it? If you lived back then, yes, you wouldn't just eat it, you'd be thankful for it. You'd scrape the bowl, wipe the plate with your crust of bread, and order more with coins that still smelled like gunpowder. You'd laugh with strangers, curse the cook, toast with whiskey, and maybe end the night with a slice of pie and a story worth telling. Because saloon food wasn't glamorous, it was gritty, greasy, and real. And in a world that was still wild, that was enough. Long before tattoos were a modern form of expression, they were something far older, etched not for fashion, but with deep meaning and purpose. Let's travel back to a time when civilization as we know it didn't exist, and people lived in close connection with the natural world. Discovered in 1991, frozen in a glacier between Austria and Italy was the mummified body of a person from an ancient era. His body was over 5,000 years old, older than the pyramids and Stonehenge. Yet across his leathery skin, researchers found something strikingly familiar: tattoos. There were 61 of them to be precise. They weren't decorative images, but dark marks, dots, and lines running down his back, behind his knees, and around his ankles. What makes this fascinating is that the locations of these tattoos matched known anatomical points. Was this a primitive form of pain relief, an ancient healing practice, or something more spiritual, a rite of endurance carved directly into the body? We may never know for sure, but one thing is clear. Even in that distant time, people were already marking their bodies with intention. And this person wasn't alone. In ancient lands, tattoos appeared predominantly on women, including priestesses and dancers. These weren't decorative butterflies or names of loved ones, but symbolic patterns often placed on the abdomen, thighs, and chest. Some scholars believe these tattoos were meant to offer protection during important life events, to channel fertility, or to ward off unwanted energy. In Nubia, south of the region, archaeologists unearthed mummies with animal figures tattooed on their limbs, symbols of power and survival. Across these early societies, tattoos weren't acts of rebellion. They were acts of reverence, resilience, and ritual. They carried meaning not just in the ink, but in the permanence and belief they represented. So next time you see someone's arm of ink, remember they're carrying on a tradition that began in the ice, in the sand, and in the quiet of forgotten millennia. If you ever thought tattoos were just stylish accessories, try saying that in front of a Polynesian chief and watch the room fall silent. In Polynesian cultures, tattoos weren't optional or for show. They were sacred. In fact, the word tattoo comes from a local word meaning to strike. And that's exactly how it began, with bone tools dipped in soot and rhythmically tapped into the skin with a stick. Each strike echoed centuries of tradition. In places like Samoa and New Zealand, tattoos weren't just art, they were identity. A person's intricate facial tattoos could tell you everything you needed to know about their status, their family, their ancestry, and their achievements. The face wasn't just a canvas, it was a living biography. Removing a person's facial tattoos would be like erasing their entire life story. Young men would often receive their first tattoos during painful ceremonies. This wasn't a casual decision, it was a spiritual transformation. The process was grueling, with no painkillers, just raw courage and a shared belief in the purpose of the pain. Women were also tattooed, often on the lips, chin, or thighs, with symbols of beauty, maturity, and a certain sacred energy believed to flow through all living things. A woman without tattoos could be considered incomplete, a blank canvas in a world full of stories. But external forces, as they often do, tried to erase it all. Outsiders arrived, bringing shame and seeing the tattoos as primitive. In some areas, traditional tattooing was forbidden, forcing it underground like a sacred language spoken only in whispers. Still, the ink endured. Today, many people in these cultures are reclaiming their tattoo heritage with pride. The ancient tools have returned, the designs have resurfaced, and across the Pacific, you can hear the sound of the tattooing once again. It is not just an art form, but an act of cultural survival. These aren't just marks on the skin. They were and still are declarations of identity and belonging. Step into the world of ancient philosophers and warriors, and you might not expect to find tattoos. When we think of these cultures, we picture marble statues and clean, idealized bodies. But if you look closer, you'll find ink hidden in the shadows. In this ancient civilization, tattoos were originally linked with slaves and criminals. In fact, the word stigma, the root of our modern term, referred to the permanent marks burned or inked into someone's skin as a form of punishment. These weren't symbolic or decorative, they were labels and warnings. If you were a runaway slave or a captured enemy, your captor might tattoo your forehead with a message like, "Stop me, I ran away," a permanent sign etched into the skin. The Romans, being pragmatic, adopted this idea and took it further. Soldiers were often tattooed to mark their loyalty, a kind of flesh-bound dog tag. But they also used tattoos to brand gladiators, slaves, and prisoners of war. It wasn't about identity, it was about ownership. There's a darker twist here. Early followers of a new belief system, persecuted by the Roman authorities, were sometimes tattooed as a form of humiliation. But centuries later, they would reclaim the practice. Pilgrims to a sacred city often returned with small symbols tattooed on their arms as a sign of their devotion. What began as a tool of punishment morphed into a badge of faith. Interestingly, a later emperor who legalized the new religion banned tattooing on the face, not because it was cruel, but because he declared the face was made in a perfect image and shouldn't be defiled. The irony was that bodies were still fair game. Unlike in the Pacific Islands, where tattoos elevated a person's social standing, in the Greco-Roman world, they often lowered it. Tattoos marked you as an outsider or a captive. But they also told a story, not always one you wanted, but one you carried forever. In these empires of law, conquest, and spectacle, tattoos weren't about self-expression. They were a form of branding, sometimes literally, a tool of control, punishment, and power. And like all marks of oppression, they would eventually be reclaimed. The paradox of marks. While the West branded its captives and outcasts, the East took a more spiritual and symbolic approach to body art, where tattoos could be both sacred protection and a social paradox. In India, though more famous for temporary body art, there's a long history of permanent tattoos. Among tribal communities, they were considered both decorative and protective. A woman might be tattooed with symbols of fertility or strength, not on a whim, but as part of a deeply rooted tradition. These tattoos were seen as jewelry for the soul, something no one could steal. Meanwhile, in Japan, the story was more complicated. In early days, tattoos may have had a spiritual meaning, but later, tattooing became a form of punishment. Criminals were marked on the face or arm with symbols indicating their crime, permanently branding them as untrustworthy. But then, a fascinating counterculture emerged. Outcasts and laborers adopted tattoos not as a sign of shame, but of honor. They created elaborate, full-body designs called irezumi, often showing dragons and mythological figures. These were masterpieces that told a story, a personal legend etched beneath society's judgment. At the same time, religious pilgrims in Southeast Asia developed sakyan tattoos, geometric designs and writings believed to offer protection and spiritual blessings. These were administered by monks using sharpened bamboo or steel rods, always accompanied by chants. In the East, tattoos could be holy or forbidden, sacred or criminal. It all depended on who wore them and why. But one thing was certain, in these cultures, skin was never silent. It spoke of power, punishment, prayer, and pride. As one great civilization gave way to the next, the practice of tattooing began to vanish from the Western world. Why? Because to the new dominant belief system, the body was no longer just flesh. It was a temple, and temples apparently were not meant to be scribbled on. The new believers had a complex relationship with tattoos. Some adopted them as declarations of faith, with pilgrims traveling far and wide to have small crosses tattooed on their wrists, a permanent spiritual passport. But this was the exception, not the rule. By the early medieval period, the main message from religious authorities was clear. Marking the body was a forbidden practice. A certain ancient text was often cited. You shall not make any cuttings in your flesh for the dead, nor tattoo any marks upon you. That single line was enough to bury an entire art form across much of Europe. Tattoos became associated with forbidden practices and heresy. But even in this era of suppression, the ink never truly vanished. In the far reaches of a great empire, some groups still practiced religious tattooing, small crosses etched onto hands and arms to protect against unwanted capture. In a distant land in Africa, local believers maintained tattoo traditions as well, marking new followers with sacred symbols. And among the soldiers who marched to the Holy Land, tattoos made a quiet return. Some etched small crosses on their bodies, not just for spiritual protection, but so that if they died in battle, they could be buried as believers, their faith visible even in death. So while the medieval West tried to erase the art of tattooing, it never quite succeeded. The ink hid in secret places, waiting to rise again. As the age of exploration began and ships sailed into unknown oceans, tattoos found a new canvas: sailors. These weren't royal artists or spiritual leaders, they were rough men, calloused by salt and superstition, who began decorating their bodies with anchors, mermaids, and sacred symbols. But how did tattoos return to Europe after centuries in exile? In the 18th century, a famous captain's voyages to the Pacific Islands changed everything. When his crew arrived, they encountered entire societies marked in ink. Intrigued, many sailors got tattooed themselves, both to honor the cultures they encountered and to prove they'd been somewhere exotic. Returning to port with tattoos wasn't just fashionable, it was a kind of living record of where you'd sailed and what you'd survived. Soon, tattoos became the unofficial uniform of the seafaring class. But it wasn't just about style, it was steeped in superstition. An anchor on the forearm symbolized stability. A pig and a rooster, often on the feet, were believed to prevent drowning. Some sailors even tattooed "hold fast" on their knuckles, hoping it would give them the grip to survive rough seas. And then there were the sacred icons, crosses on the back, or a certain female figure over the heart. Sailors believed these tattoos offered divine protection, an extra layer of spiritual armor when the ocean turned against them. As these inked-up sailors returned to ports, tattoos spread with them, not to the wealthy, but to the working class, dock workers, soldiers, and wanderers. Tattoos were now the language of the lower classes, the daring and the defiant. Still, they held meaning. During a certain civil conflict in a new country, soldiers began tattooing their names and regiments on their arms, a grim way to ensure they could be identified if they died in battle. A small, painful insurance policy. So, while powerful rulers and religious leaders avoided tattoos, the men who mapped the world wore them with pride. For them, each mark was a story, a wound, a charm, and a prayer. And when the world ended in waves or cannon fire, it might be the only thing left that told your name. By the 19th and 20th centuries, tattoos had moved far from sacred temples and tribal rituals. In many parts of the world, they had become marks of defiance, especially behind bars. Prisons gave tattoos a new language, a gritty, coded one, spoken in needles, razors, and improvised ink. In Russia, a secret society of tattoos flourished in labor camps. These weren't decorative, they were biographical and hierarchical. A star on the shoulders meant you commanded respect. Barbed wire around the neck meant a life sentence. A building with domes on your chest, each dome represented a year served. These tattoos told your crimes and your rank. But if you wore a symbol you hadn't earned, you might find it forcibly carved off. In Japan, a certain group of individuals transformed the art of tattooing, once a punishment, into a badge of honor. Full-body suits of dragons and tigers were often hidden beneath business suits. Getting tattooed was an act of loyalty, painful, expensive, and permanent. In Western prisons, tattoos also carried hidden meanings. A teardrop beneath the eye might signal a crime committed. Cobwebs on the elbows could symbolize a long sentence. Dots on the knuckles, numbers, and acronyms. Entire identities were rewritten in ink, hidden from guards, but clear to anyone who spoke the language. These tattoos were often done with smuggled sewing needles, paper clips, and melted pens for ink. There was no glamour here, just pain and symbolism. For many inmates, it was less about art and more about identity, proof that you belonged, or a warning that you didn't. Outside prison walls, these tattoos carried a heavy stigma. They marked you as dangerous, untouchable, beyond redemption. But for the people who wore them, the ink was often the only constant, the only part of themselves they owned in a system built to strip everything else away. Tattoos in prison weren't fashion, they were survival. From rebellion to mainstream, by the time the 20th century hit its stride, tattoos had gone from sacred symbols and outlaw code to mainstream rebellion. If religious authorities once saw tattoos as marks of sin, modern society began to see them as symbols of freedom. In the early 1900s, you could still find tattooed performers in circus sideshows, tattooed ladies and illustrated men who charged admission to show off their fully inked skin. It was taboo wrapped in spectacle. But something began to shift. Soldiers returning from World War II brought back simple tattoos, anchors, eagles, or hearts, as personal emblems of pain and patriotism. These tattoos weren't for show. They were keepsakes burned into the skin as reminders of what they had seen. Then came the counterculture. In the 1960s and 70s, tattoos began to break out of their working-class roots and onto the bodies of rock stars and poets. The act of getting a tattoo, still a bit frowned upon by polite society, became an act of defiance, a way to say, "I don't care what you think." Tattoo parlors were no longer just hidden dens, they started to go legitimate. Artists turned the needle into a brush, and suddenly, tattoos weren't just symbols, they were personal, political statements. The stigma didn't vanish overnight. Even into the late 20th century, having visible tattoos could hurt your chances of getting a job. But the tide was turning. Tattoo TV shows emerged, celebrities embraced full sleeves, and tattoo conventions became popular. The art form was no longer a subculture, it was culture. The modern Renaissance. In a world where everything from our voices to our memories lives in the cloud, something as physical as a tattoo might seem outdated. But instead, tattoos have entered a renaissance, not just surviving the digital age, but evolving with it. Today, tattoos are more than just ink. Some artists use technology to generate hyper-detailed designs. There's even the rise of smart tattoos, experimental patches embedded with sensors that can track vitals. It's not science fiction, it's being tested in labs. Even without the tech, tattooing is booming. What was once taboo is now accepted across professions and cultures. Doctors, teachers, and business leaders all have them. Social media has democratized the art form, allowing artists to build global audiences. And yet, the meaning behind tattoos has become even more personal. People now tattoo sound waves of loved ones' voices, coordinates of where they met their partners, or constellations from the night their child was born. These marks are etched forever, to remember, to heal, and to belong. Cultural tattooing is also seeing a resurgence, as communities from the Arctic to the Andes revive ancestral designs, reclaiming their identity through skin. What was once suppressed is now proudly worn. Of course, debates still exist. Is it art or a trend? Sacred or superficial? But perhaps that's the point. Tattoos have always lived in that gray area between pain and beauty, permanence and change. They are both primal and futuristic. And as long as humans crave meaning, memory, and a way to mark their story, tattoos will endure. Before empires clashed and a certain kind of liquid, like a deep shade of red, soaked the land, Tamiris was simply a daughter of the plains. She was born into the vast open steppes, a brutal, free, and endless landscape. This was the world of the Masagatai, a fierce nomadic people who rode like spirits of the plains. Their lives were shaped by survival, honor, and warfare. We know little of Tomiris's early life, but we can imagine it. She would have learned to ride before she could run, and to use a weapon before she could speak in full sentences. Among her people, girls were not confined to tents. They trained with the boys, rode with the warriors, and grew up with metal in their blood. To lead, one had to show strength, and Tomiris, even as a young woman, proved her worth. Her tribe lived off their herds and buried their dead with weapons, ready for battle in the next life. They had no cities, but they had pride. And when enemies came, they were met not with empty words, but with arrows. Tomiris likely came to power after her husband's death. But what's certain is that when the moment came, she didn't just inherit leadership, she seized it. In a time when most women were considered property, Tomiris commanded an army. She negotiated with powerful figures and dared to speak as an equal. If they didn't listen, she made them. She was more than a queen. She was a war chief who would soon face the greatest empire on earth. But power, especially for a woman, never comes without a price. As Tomiris began to secure her rule, whispers of her power grew louder. Far to the south, a king was watching. His name was Cyrus, and he wanted more. The stage was set. The wind howled across the plains, and Tomiris, daughter of warriors, was about to ride into legend. While Tomiris reigned over the open steppes, a different kind of power was rising to the south, structured, imperial, and relentless. Cyrus the Great, founder of a vast empire, had already conquered wide swaths of land. His banners flew over deserts, mountains, and cities where cultures changed every few miles. But Cyrus wasn't finished. He was a builder of empires, and every builder eventually looks to the horizon. To Cyrus, the Masagatai were a threat wrapped in opportunity. They weren't rich in gold or cities, but they controlled the northeastern frontier, which meant access to key lands, resources, and trade routes. More importantly, the Masagatai had something no empire could afford to ignore: pride. And pride, in Cyrus's eyes, could be bent or broken. He knew that brute force wasn't always the best first move, so he tried a different approach. He proposed marriage. According to ancient sources, Cyrus sent envoys to Tomiris offering an alliance through matrimony. It seemed like a royal match, but Tomiris was not naive. She saw the proposal for what it was: a calculated attempt to absorb her people without a fight. She declined, and that rejection didn't sit well with the king. With diplomacy over, Cyrus shifted to his favorite language: war. He ordered his army to cross the Araxes River, the natural barrier separating his empire from the Masagatai. He was going to take what Tomiris refused to give. But Tomiris was ready. She knew the terrain and how her people fought, fast and furious on horseback. She knew Cyrus wasn't just coming for land. He was coming to crush a woman who dared to say no. The world's most powerful king had declared war, but he had no idea what kind of fury he had just awakened. The bait and the fury. Cyrus, a master strategist, believed he could outwit Tomiris. He had faced kings and crushed nations. To him, the Masagatai were just wild nomads with fast horses and no cities to defend. He didn't realize he was facing someone just as cunning and far more furious. Tomiris had warned him after she rejected his marriage offer, sending a clear message: cross the river and you will regret it. But Cyrus crossed anyway, building a bridge of boats to bring his army into her land. Instead of striking immediately, Tomiris pulled her forces back, luring Cyrus deeper into unfamiliar terrain. The Persians found an abandoned camp well stocked with food and, more importantly, wine, a luxury the nomadic Masagatai rarely indulged in. It was a baited trap, and Cyrus took it, thinking the enemy had fled. He left a portion of his army under a general. When the Massagetae returned under the cover of night, they fell upon the drunk and unsuspecting Persians with deadly precision. The battle was swift and brutal. Among the dead was a Massagetae commander who was also Tomiris' son. Some accounts say he was captured and took his own life. Others claim he was killed in the fighting, but all agree when the news reached Tomiris, something inside her shattered and then turned to steel. Her grief was volcanic, but her rage became legendary. She sent another message to Cyrus, this time not a warning, but a vow. I will give you your fill of blood. She promised to make the ground run red with Persian blood, and her vengeance would not be quiet. Cyrus had taken her son. Now he would face not the queen, but the mother of a slain warrior. The sun rose like a blade over the plains. Tomiris stood at the head of her army, no longer just a queen, but a force of nature. Her warriors, hardened by their nomadic life, were ready for battle. Cyrus, for all his might, had underestimated them. He assumed they would fight chaotically, easy to crush, but Tomiris knew how to strike with precision. She launched a ferocious counterattack, with her cavalry sweeping across the plains like a tide of knives. They fired arrows from horseback and fought with axes, fighting like people with nothing left to lose. The Persians, disciplined and experienced, were not expecting this level of organized fury. Tomiris fought beside her troops, her presence igniting them like wildfire. Every strike was driven by vengeance. Cyrus's army was routed. Many died where they stood, others fled and were hunted down. And Cyrus the Great, the man who had conquered a great part of the ancient world, fell in the chaos. What came next is infamous. According to some sources, Tomiris found Cyrus's body on the battlefield, ordered his head severed, and in a final act of revenge, submerged it in a container filled with human blood. "Drink your fill," she reportedly said, "of the blood you thirsted for." Was it historical fact or a poetic flourish? Perhaps both. But the message was eternal. Tomiris was not to be conquered. When the dust settled, Tomiris stood victorious. She had done what no army before her could. News of the defeat sent shockwaves across the ancient world. The mighty empire was humiliated by a woman from the steppes. Cyrus's body was eventually returned and buried with honor, but the stain of his defeat would linger. For Tomiris and her people, the victory was more than revenge. It was a declaration. She had stood up to the world's most powerful ruler and not only survived, but triumphed. And then she vanished from history. No records survive detailing her later years or death. It's as if, after taking her vengeance, Tomiris simply rode back into the horizon. Much of what we know about Tomiris comes not from her own people, but from a Greek historian named Herodotus. Writing a century after her time, he immortalized Tomiris in his works, portraying her as a warrior queen of astonishing resolve and terrifying vengeance. But Herodotus wasn't just reporting facts. He was weaving a story, part chronicle and part morality tale. To him and his Greek audience, Tomiris represented the ultimate reversal of imperial arrogance. Her victory was almost mythic, and Herodotus treated it as such. He even included the gruesome detail of the blood-filled container. Modern historians endlessly debate whether this part was true. Some argue that Herodotus exaggerated the tale to humble the Persian Empire, a rival to the Greek world at the time. Others believe the core event, Cyrus's death at the hands of Tomiris, likely happened. There is also the question of bias. Herodotus often filtered foreign cultures through a Greek lens, portraying the Massagetae as noble and free, an exotic mirror to Greek ideals of honor. In that light, Tomiris wasn't just a powerful woman. She was a moral counterweight to Persian ambition. Still, Herodotus succeeded in one thing. He ensured Tomyris would not be forgotten. Because of him, she became a legend. The nomadic queen's influence. Though she may have slain one of the ancient world's most iconic emperors, Tomyris never ruled an empire herself. Her people were nomads, living by the rhythms of the land, not by walls. This meant her legacy was never set in stone. There were no royal coins with her likeness or archives with her decrees. Instead, her story was passed on through song and whispers. The Masajatai were one of many powerful tribes of the Central Asian steppes. Their cousins, like the Scythians and the Saka, were all expert horse archers. These tribes were feared for their mobility and ferocity. Tomyris, as a female leader, was rare but not entirely unique. Steppe culture, unlike many settled civilizations, gave women greater freedoms. Women rode, hunted, and even led. Archaeological findings of female warriors buried with weapons have confirmed that the stories of fierce women of the steppes were more than just legends. Tomyris stood at the pinnacle of that tradition. Her power came not from inheritance or a specific belief system, but from respect, grit, and sheer ability. She was a unifying force among scattered clans and a military commander in a landscape where survival meant riding faster and fearing nothing. Because her people left no monuments, Tomyris became a kind of phantom queen, her name echoing in the writings of outsiders and in the oral traditions of the steppe. To Persian chroniclers, she was a warning. To the Greeks, a marvel. And to her own people, she was a memory carried in bloodlines and battle songs. Her legend endured not in the palaces of kings, but in the hearts of those who refused to bow. In many ways, Tomyris embodied a defiance that transcended geography. Her story belonged to no one empire, which made it both dangerous and inspiring. In the medieval period, some chroniclers mentioned her name, and by the Renaissance, European artists rediscovered her tale. Painters depicted her in elaborate armor, standing triumphantly over Cyrus's body. This was not just theatrical, it was political, as these artists were fascinated by a woman who didn't just survive in a man's world, she won. In the 19th and 20th centuries, Tomyris became a nationalist icon in regions like Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan. Poets and educators reclaimed her as a historical heroine, a symbol of a proud, untamed past. Her name appeared in textbooks, on statues, and even in military ceremonies. Tomyris left no empire behind and no palace to excavate, and yet her name still lives. She stands as a contradiction to how history often remembers women, not as a footnote, but as a force of destiny. She didn't beg for recognition, she took it. She didn't ride behind a king, she rode against one and won. Today, her statues rise from Central Asian cities, and her face adorns coins and textbooks. To modern Central Asians, she is a mother of nations, a link to a proud nomadic past, a reminder that their identity was born not in submission, but in the cry of battle. She taught us that dignity is not given, it is seized. Empires fall, but legends ride. And somewhere in the winds of the steppe, the queen still gallops, unbeaten and unforgettable. The dawn of security. Long before modern surveillance, humans faced a simpler problem: how to keep their belongings safe from thieves and rivals. As societies became more settled, possessions accumulated, and with them came the need for a way to secure them. The earliest known attempt at mechanical security dates back to ancient Egypt, roughly 4,000 years ago. The Egyptian wooden pinlock was a marvel of early engineering. It used a wooden bolt with a set of holes and wooden pegs. When the correct key, a large wooden tool with corresponding pins, was inserted, the pegs were lifted, allowing the bolt to slide open. When the key was removed, gravity dropped the pegs back into place, locking the door. These locks weren't just a novelty. They were used on storage rooms, tombs, and temple gates. While they may seem primitive, their brilliance lies in their underlying logic. They weren't merely physical barriers, they were puzzles designed to challenge anyone who was not invited. These Egyptian locks reveal a deeper truth about the people who made them. They didn't just fear theft, they anticipated it. They invested time and skill in protecting things that mattered, laying the groundwork for the field of security. When you lock your door, you are continuing a tradition started by ancient hands. The Egyptian wooden pin lock was the ancestor of nearly every pin tumbler mechanism used today. Imagine a large wooden door with a bolt that slides horizontally to block the entrance. The bolt has several holes, and inside each hole is a wooden peg. These pegs drop into slots cut into the door frame, locking the bolt. The key, a large wooden tool with corresponding pegs, is inserted into the bolt, pushing the pegs up just enough to clear the frame slots. Once the pegs are lifted, the bolt can slide open. When the key is removed, the pins fall back down, relocking the door. This was mechanical memory without springs or gears, just wood, weight, and ingenuity. These locks were impressive because they balanced complexity with reliability. They were easy to craft but difficult to bypass without the correct key. Since each one was hand-carved, keys weren't interchangeable. The concept spread widely to other civilizations, showing that while Egypt invented the idea, the lock had legs. Beyond their practical use, these locks also held symbolic power, signifying reverence and the belief that certain things should remain untouched unless you were worthy enough to possess the key. While the Egyptians gave us the earliest mechanical locks, ancient Mesopotamia pioneered a different form of security that relied on identity and authority. In the land between the Tigris and Euphrates, security wasn't sealed with bolts, but with cylinder seals. These small carved stone rollers were engraved with unique images or inscriptions. The seals were rolled over wet clay used to close containers, doors, or official documents. This served as an ancient combination of a signature and a barcode. Once impressed, the seal left a continuous, non-duplicable pattern. If someone tampered with the seal or opened the container, the broken clay made the unauthorized access obvious. This approach focused on deterrence through visibility. The seal didn't stop you from opening something, it publicly announced that you had. High-ranking officials and merchants had their own personalized seals, which were often passed down through generations. These seals carried so much prestige that some people were even buried with them. Mesopotamian security also involved using ropes and elaborate knots to secure treasuries, with any tampering being clearly visible. The idea was always to make the risk of exposure more terrifying than the reward of theft. To protect something in Mesopotamia wasn't just to keep it hidden, it was to publicly proclaim who had the right to touch it. The ancient Greek city-states grew, so did their need for security. However, they were slower to develop mechanical locks than their neighbors. Instead, they relied heavily on trust, social norms, and physical barriers. They used simple bar and pin locks for doors and chests. These keys were often large, flat iron rods shaped like an F or P that were almost as long as a person's forearm. Carrying one around made it obvious that you had something to protect. Greek keys and locks weren't just functional, they also held cultural significance. Being entrusted with a key symbolized authority and responsibility. In Homer's writings, a certain character's role as a key holder was a symbol of her power within the household. However, Greek locks had limitations. They were crude and could be easily forced open. What truly kept valuables secure was a combination of concealment, guards, and communal expectations. In temples, rooms were sealed with rope and wax, and multiple officials were needed to open them.
While the Greeks didn't focus on creating complex locks, they laid the cultural groundwork for keys as symbols of status and security, as a balance between strength and social control.
If the Egyptians gave us the concept of the pin lock and the Greeks wove trust into tradition, the Romans elevated lockmaking into a practical art. With their metallurgical skill and obsession with order, the Romans brought precision, portability, and innovation to ancient security. Their locks were primarily made of bronze and iron, allowing for greater durability and more intricate designs. They adopted the Egyptian principle but miniaturized and refined it. Roman locksmiths created warded locks, which used internal obstacles that only a properly shaped key could bypass. Their keys were marvels themselves, from large staff-like keys for city gates to finely crafted ring keys worn on the finger like jewelry. These ring keys offered constant access to locked boxes without the need to carry bulky tools, blending status with utility. But the real genius came with Roman puzzle locks, complex mechanisms where pressing the wrong latch or turning the wrong angle could trap the lock tighter. These were used to secure valuables, hide documents, or even conceal poison. The Romans also institutionalized the use of locks in banks, granaries, and military storerooms. A lock wasn't just a tool, it was a statement of ownership, authority, and exclusion. It gave rise to the idea that a civilized society needed systems to protect it. While the West was forging intricate metal locks, ancient China took a path that blended practicality with philosophy. Chinese engineers developed locks that were simple, durable, and often symbolic. The most common was the sliding bolt lock, made of bronze or iron, which used spring-loaded tumblers. This principle, the core of the modern pin tumbler lock, was alive in China as early as 200 BCE. Unlike Roman locks, Chinese locks were compact and discreet. They were often crafted in the shape of animals like dragons, symbolizing protection, or fish representing abundance. A lock wasn't just for security, it carried a deeper meaning. They also played ceremonial roles, such as in weddings, where love locks represented the couple's bond. Some were even designed to confuse thieves with hidden mechanisms and false keyholes, buying precious time. Chinese security culture was built on a harmony between utility, symbolism, and clever design.
In ancient India, security was less about brute force and more about clever concealment and symbolic barriers. Indian locks were designed to mislead and warn. Puzzle locks and trick mechanisms were common in temples and treasure chests. Some required multiple hidden actions to open, while others had decoy keyholes to confuse anyone not invited. Temples, which housed valuable offerings and relics, used layered security. The storage area might be sealed with wax, knotted rope, and a stamped clay emblem, each carrying spiritual weight. Breaking the seal was not just a crime, but a sacrilege. Locks were often engraved with religious symbols, intended to intimidate the superstitious and imbue the object with symbolic armor. To touch such a lock without permission was an affront to the gods. In royal courts and merchant caravans, small portable locks were used to secure goods. Key design was highly individualized, with a single artisan often responsible for both the lock and its matching key. In ancient India, the best lock didn't merely block entry, it puzzled, protected, and whispered, "Only the rightful may pass."